In this presentation, I'm going to be going over some of the tips and tricks that I presented at this year's AU class for Maya. So these tips and tricks are going to be really useful if you're new to Maya. If you're an old school user of Maya, there may be a few things in here that you didn't know about, so it might be worth watching anyway, but it really was catered toward sort of the newer user of Maya. Hopefully, if you are an expert user of Maya, there's still something of value inside of here, or maybe something that you forgot about that rejogs your memory a little bit. So the first thing that we're going to talk about are some of the default preferences that I change inside of Maya when I first start working with it to make it a little bit better. The undo queue is set to 20 by default, which I think is kind of silly, so I always crank that up to 200 or 300. I don't put it to infinite because it'll basically run you out of memory eventually. All the undos are saved in memory, so I put it up to a finite number that's relatively high. The next thing that I like to change in the system preferences is selection. I like to change the click box size to make this a little bit bigger. What this does is it allows you to not actually have to touch the actual pixel of a vertice or an edge or something like that if you're trying to pick it. It gives you a little bit of looseness to your selection. It lets you pick slightly off of an object and still have it the click register. So clicking that box size up a few numbers I find helps working with Maya a good bit. The last thing that I want to draw your attention to is in the File Projects folder. Inside of here, there is the ability to ignore file version. I always turn that on. The reason I always turn this on is because if I want to go back to an older version of Maya, or if I'm working an older version of Maya and I want to bring in a newer file, like a 2013 file, maybe into Maya 2010, if ignore file version's been flagged or turned on, I know that that object will open up and I don't have to go resorting to using a Maya ASCII file and hacking the header. So it allows you to open Maya binary files from newer cuts and older cuts. Another thing worth mentioning is in rendering and in render views, make sure that you turn on the use 32-bit float for your Maya renderer, and I always switch this from Maya software to Mental Ray. So those are a few things that I normally do when I first start Maya on a new machine or do an install of Maya on a new machine. The next thing that I want to talk about, kind of just generic things that I always do when setting up Maya, is I always install bonus tools right here that you can see. So these are a variety of tools that add functionality to Maya. They're not officially supported tools, but they're extremely useful when working with Maya. I use them all the time, and they're broken down into kind of different categories. Stephen Rosell has been working with this, and he's done a great job of reorganizing it so that it makes really good sense. But it adds tons of functionality to the application, and they're accessible through the help menu, where you go and say resources and tools, download bonus tools. You can also download vegetation and things like that, but the bonus tools are really the ones that I would recommend getting. While we're in the help menu, it's worth mentioning suggest a feature, small annoying things. So small annoying things are submitted by users. We fix a good bit of them every release. I think we fixed about 30 small annoying things in 2014. So make sure that you log the things that are bothering you inside of Maya that are easy for us to address, or that you would perceive to be easy for us to address, so that we can go ahead and fix those. Another thing worth mentioning in the help menu is the customer involvement program. Make sure you turn this on. It basically is a voting system. This is what sends information back to us when Maya crashes. It gives you the ability to add some notes to it. And this stuff really is looked at. If Maya is crashing and CIP data is coming back for all over the world in the same area, we know we have a serious problem there, and that's going to be the first thing that's going to get looked at when it comes time to fixing bugs in the application. So think of CIP as sort of a voting mechanism, kind of like small annoying things. If you give us the data, we know where to put our effort into fixing the application. So a couple of other things worth mentioning that I do all the time that are sort of generic is I use the increment and save. This was added a couple of releases ago. It's just a simple hotkey. It sort of goes 0.001.mb, 0.002.mb. I use that all the time, the increment and save, as well as archive scene. Archive scene will go through and find all of your textures and your shaders, and it'll put it all into one nice tidy little zipped up file. So archive scene and incremental save are two things that I find extremely useful. All right, so let's go ahead and hop into the application and start talking about some generic things that some people know and some people don't know. So when you're grabbing a piece of geometry and you start to use these manipulators to interact with it, you can use your plus and minus keys to adjust the size of those manipulators. This is really useful especially for things like the virtual trackball. If you make the virtual trackball really large, it gives you sort of finer control. Another thing worth mentioning is most people think you actually have to touch the handles to move objects inside of Maya, and that's simply not true. Once you've constrained to an axis, you can move off the object and use the middle mouse button. You can also use the Shift key to gesturally swipe to an axis. So you see that I'm not actually touching any of those arrows. I'm just holding my Shift key and my middle mouse button and gesturally swiping in the direction I want to move. If I hold down the J key, it turns on discrete snap. So this is going to start snapping to a value of 10. If we go into our rotate tool and hold down the J key, you'll see that it's going to snap to a value of 15. That discrete value that the snapping set to can be changed in the tool options. Another way of accessing these tool options that a lot of people don't know about is through the use of a marker menu. Most people know that you can hit, Q for select, W for move, E for rotate, R for scale. But a lot of people don't realize that if you hold down the Q key or the W key and click with your left mouse button while the W key is still held down, you can get to the options for that tool. Obviously, you can do the same thing for the rotate tool. So if you hit E, click down with the left mouse button, you get those options for that rotate tool. So the next thing that we want to talk about is the ability to use the channel box to change attributes. So most people know that you can grab a variety of attributes and make a change to them really quickly. What a lot of people don't realize is that if you hold down or if you highlight any of these attributes in the channel box, you can use your screen as a giant slider to begin manipulating that attribute. So this works for translation attributes. It would also work for any of the inputs. So any of the history attributes like revolve or an extrude or something like that. Those would also basically have the ability to have your screen become a giant input slider for any of those given attributes. It's also worth mentioning that in the attribute editor, you can use these attributes to go ahead and do something like you can change the values in these attributes by holding down the control key. So if I control with my left mouse button, start dragging on that translate value, you can see that it becomes an input device. If I use my middle mouse button, it's a little bit faster in its movement. And if I use my right mouse button, it moves even faster. So left, middle, and right are basically small, medium, and large value changes for a given attribute on a node. Another thing that's kind of cool with the attribute editor is at any given time, you can actually start writing expressions in here. So I could say, you know what? This translation in Y is equal to rand. Oops, I got to spell that correctly. So you can just start writing expressions directly in the attribute editor. We'll do 1 to 0. So now if we play this back, we have that little expression driving that attribute. We'll delete the expression and get rid of that. But it's a couple of little hidden things inside of the attribute editor that are very, very useful, as well as the control editor, that kind of micro screen input device that we have. So in the outliner, we also have lots of really kind of cool little tricks that you can do. The outliner, you can use your arrow keys. If you start by highlighting a node in the outliner and you use your left and right arrow keys, you can basically start jumping through that list of nodes. If you get to a group that has children, if you use your up and down arrow keys, it allows you to dive in and out of the group. So if I hit my down arrow key and then start clicking my left and right arrow keys, you can see I'm now jumping through that list of the children nodes. Obviously, if I want to get back up one level, I hit the up arrow key, and then I can start using my left and right arrow keys to jump through that list. A couple of other things that you can do with the arrow keys that are kind of interesting. You can use them to nudge objects. So if I'm in my translate tool and I hold down my alt key and start using my arrow keys, I'm basically moving this 1 pixel at a time. So alt, and then any of the arrow keys will basically start nudging your objects. A couple of other things that you can do in the outliner. If you hold down your shift key and you click on a group, it will expand that whole group and all of its children. If this list gets really long and you need to select things at the top of the list as well as the bottom of the list, you can use the handy function of splitting that list into 2. So by splitting the list in 2, I can view things at the bottom as well as the top at the same time. So a couple of other camera tricks that we have when working with Maya. If you use your bracket keys, it allows you to undo the camera movements. And I'm still basically using my left and right bracket keys to jump through all the different camera movements that I've done. When working with cameras inside of Maya, we can obviously switch between cameras using a marker menu. By holding down the space bar and going to the middle of Maya, I can say, you know what, show me my top view, or my left view, or my perspective view. Recently, we added the ability to view the different perspectives. So you'll see in my scene here, I've got two perspectives, and I can switch between those by just jumping through and hitting the perspective more than once. So whatever list of perspective views you have, as you cycle through them, you can just basically use your marker menu swipe to do that. Another interesting way of switching the cameras is just by using the outliner and dragging and dropping them into the view. If you're working with a really large scene, maybe some architectural data, often you'll bring that in and you won't see the full scene. And the reason that happens is the cameras actually have placement nodes. So you can see as I grab this camera and I begin placing it, if we now look through that camera, I'm not really seeing that girl's hand. The reason that's happened is because it's getting cut off. It doesn't matter how much I zoom out, right? I'm zooming in and out, but I'm still not seeing her hand because of where that actual placement node is for that camera. So if you're working with very large scenes, often you're going to need to grab those cameras and slide them out a little bit so that you can then see the full object, your full scene. So, if you have skyscrapers, you might need to grab that top window and translate it up. Or the side windows, you might need to pull back a little bit so that you can actually see exactly what's happening in that scene by repositioning those cameras. This is worth mentioning also with cameras in large scenes is the Z information, the Z buffer and the clipping planes. A good way to illustrate that is by looking through this camera here. As I start to zoom in and out, you can see that we're getting kind of some buffering issues. The inside piece of geometry on this car is very close to the outside piece of geometry. So Maya doesn't know what to do with that because of the limited resolution of our Z buffer. And that's set with the clipping planes. So if you go ahead and you say View, select Camera, and bring up the attribute editors for this, if you've got a very large scene, you're going to want to change that near clipping plane to something like a value of 1. You don't want it to be 0.001. So if this far clipping plane has a giant value, 10,000, a million, 100,000, you're going to need to change that near clipping plane to a higher value to get that Z information to be a little bit more precise. So it's a pretty good trick. Notice that I dragged lights in here. This is basically the same as doing a view through selected. So again, on this camera, because my scene's kind of large, I'm going to want to change that near clipping plane up to something like a value of 1. When working with cameras or lights, I often like to use the T tool. So a lot of people don't know about this hotkey T. If you click the hotkey T, you'll see that it's put me basically into this direct manipulation mode. It's a really cool tool, the manipulator tool, because it allows you to do different tasks for different nodes inside of Maya. So for something like a spotlight, if I'm in my manipulation tool, I get a handle for the back of the light as well as a handle for the look at point. I also get this little clock that allows me to cycle through the different options for like the cone angle, the penumbra, the decay regions. All these different options for that spotlight show up with the manipulation tool. It's also really handy for things like the UV texture tool or any of the fields that you might use when you're working with the dynamic systems inside of Maya. You'd get if you're in the manipulation tool, you'd get the ability to adjust the magnitude in the interactive view or the attenuation in the interactive view. All these different options that show up normally on the node basically become directly accessible inside of Maya's viewport. So the manipulation tool is super handy for that. Another thing that it's really handy for is if you're doing, you want to dive back into the history of some modeling operations. So an easy way to illustrate that is just to do a couple of extrusions on a piece of geometry. So we'll get a piece of geometry in our scene here, and I'm just going to do a couple quick extrusions. So I'll highlight the component mode. I'm going to grab this face. I'm going to hold down Shift right mouse click. Most people know about this. This is something that Stephen Roselle put together. Really super useful, allows you to basically get into all your different modeling tools by just holding down the Shift right mouse click. So we'll do an extrude, maybe scale this guy down, hit the G key, it repeats your last function. Again, a very common tool inside of Maya. You're going to use it all the time. Most people know that. So we've got a bunch of different extrusions that we've done here. Now here's the thing that's kind of cool. Let's say I wanted to go back into this object and get back to one of those extrusions. If you go into your channel box, you can see all the different inputs that are basically going in here. If I'm on my direct manipulation tools, I start to click through these different extrusions. I get that direct manipulation tool back on. So it allows me to go back in there and use that to adjust, what did that extrusion do? Well, you know what? Oops, let's go back into that direct manipulation tool. What did that extrusion do? Well, I want to change some of those attributes. I want to change its scale, or maybe scale it down a little bit, or translate it down a little bit. Or if I want to go back into this and offset it, it gives me the ability to basically jump back into that history and use that manipulation tool to adjust essentially what was happening for that extrusion. So it's great not only for working with light or cameras or fields in dynamic systems, but for diving back into the history or using it maybe to change where a UV placement node was or something like that. So that direct manipulation tool is super useful, and I use it all the time. So a couple of other things that I do a lot inside of Maya is copy and paste between different cuts of Maya. So I've got a couple of versions of Maya here. If we just use I just used my Windows key to dock that guy to the left. So that was Windows left key to do that docking operation. If I grab something like a piece of geometry and I hit Control C, I basically copied that piece of geometry. If we jump back into this cut of Maya and I Control V and paste that in, you can see that we've now copied and pasted between two different cuts of Maya. I do that tons inside of Maya. The problem with this is when you do it, you get all these nodes that come in and they say pasted, pasted, pasted. And I don't like all the pasted nodes. So if we expand this stuff out, you can see all these different pasted nodes inside of here. So the way I get rid of all those pasted naming spaces that were added to that is I use a simple little trick on the rename tool. So if you say, go back to modify and go to search and replace names, and let's just grab pasted underscore here, put that in our search for, and just put a dot in the replace and apply that, you can see that it basically will go through here and it'll apply that and essentially rip all those underscore pasted off of those hierarchies. So it's a really fast, easy way of getting rid of the pasted underscore, whatever name spacing you have that you may not like, or pasted name spacing things that come in from pasting files. Just by replacing with a dot, essentially zeroes that stuff out. So it's a really super useful tool, and that search and replace tool inside of Maya, and the dot is a good trick for getting rid of and just zeroing stuff out. So another thing worth mentioning is there's a couple different places that you can add notes inside of Maya that are really useful if you're working with this file and you don't remember something. One place to do it is on the actual node. You can basically drag this up if it's not showing, and you can say this is to move the root of this girl, so putting little notes on these nodes is really useful. So when I go back to that, it tells me, what was that node doing? Another way of adding a note or kind of working with someone is you can use the grease pencil. So you could just say inside of here, pick me. That'll get saved with that actual camera. So if we jump to another camera, it's not there, but if I go back to that camera, it will be. The other perspective, it will be there. You can always create new cameras. We added this feature inside of Maya, so you can say, create camera from selected view. I've now got that same camera from that view that doesn't have the note. So this one has it, this one doesn't have it. So create view from selected camera we recently added, and I use that all the time now inside of Maya. And the last one worth mentioning is inside of bonus tools. We can create a scene annotation. So if you do this, basically this will replace this every time you open the scene. It'll come up and it'll be saved with the scene. So this screen will splash up and have notes basically when you open the file. So a nice little use of bonus tools there. I use this all the time. So the next thing that we're going to look at is a couple little tools inside of Maya. There's some great alignment tools inside of Maya, so you can grab a piece of geometry and make it align to another piece of geometry inside of Maya. A lot of people don't realize that we have really good, powerful snapping tools in Maya. So if we grab, maybe like this piece of geometry, I want to set its pivot point down a little bit. So holding down the D key allows me to change where that pivot point is. At any given time, I can turn on snapping, grid snapping, and I could snap it to an edge or something like that by holding down any of these different grid, curve, or vertice snappings. You can use the X, C, or V key to kind of enable those guys also. So I've got that pivot point kind of snapped down to the bottom. And if we go ahead and we go back into our align tools inside of Maya, so if we say modify, align tool, this allows me to grab any node inside of Maya and stack it back on top of any other node inside of Maya. And I can basically tell it, what do I want it to align to? Do I want to align to the midpoint, or do I want to align to the top of the bounding box? We can use some other kind of cool alignment tools inside of Maya, which is the Move Align tool. This one's really awesome. I love this one, the Snap Together tool. So this allows me to take any point and align it to any other point inside of Maya, and it'll basically snap those points to each other. Another kind of cool way of aligning objects to each other that a lot of people don't think about is using the grouping tool. You know, if I've got this car and I want this girl to go along for the ride of that car, you can see that at its parent node, I've sort of got this sort of offset to that orientation. You know, maybe we'll rotate this guy a little bit more. If I know I want this girl to basically get shoved into that car, instead of trying to move her over there and align her myself, I might parent her into the hierarchy of that car, and I might tell it to not preserve position to do that. So if we jump up to our top history for these guys, or if we go to our outliner and we grab our girl and our car, and I say parent, and I tell it not to preserve position. So if we turn preserve position off and we hit apply, you can see that she's going to get parented in there, and she's going to automatically get aligned to that car nicely for me. So now as I move that car around, obviously the girl's going to go along for the ride, but we match that orientation really quickly by turning off preserve position. So it's a really cool little trick that a lot of people don't realize that they can do, is change the preserve position options for a given piece of geometry. So that's basically it for the kind of nuts and bolts inside of Maya, the basic things that we wanted to cover. In the next video, we're going to look at a couple of tips and tricks when doing some basic modeling inside of Maya. So some really quick, simple things that will help you work with Maya's modeling tools, and that'll be the next video.